Hello my friends, welcome back to another landscape tutorial. I'd like to share how I painted these 3 winter scenes in my Hahnemuhle toned paper sketchbook, which I've been loving, and I will be doing a sketchbook tour soon. All of the footage here was recorded from my recent Monday live streams on Twitch, so if you ever feel like hanging out and watching, chatting, asking questions, make sure you save the date for my Monday streams. And just so you know, this month on Patreon, I released a longer step-by-step bonus tutorial where I showed how to paint 6 winter postcards. I'll leave a link in the description in case you're interested in learning that. One thing I especially love about painting on toned paper is that it immediately brings warmth to a landscape, because the underlying color is this wonderful warm beige tone. And this undertone can be fun to play with, especially in a snowy scene. I really love how the bright white snow stands out even stronger on the toned paper. When painting on toned paper, it's important to consider how much you want that beige undertone to show through. So if you want to let some of that warmth come through your colors, you can either dilute the paint or use negative space, and I'll show you both methods. My goal with this painting was to have 3 different zones. And to tie them all together, I would use little landscape details like the fence and the grasses and such to create overlap with the different tones. But overall, it's unified by that underlying warm tone. My choices of where to put which colors is not random. I'm using the classic rule of atmospheric perspective, which means your distant elements are going to be a little more muted, even a little bit more towards the blue side of things. And as you come closer to the foreground, things get a little higher contrast, a little more saturated, a little bit warmer. But I really enjoyed playing with that cool color in the foreground to make the warm tones really stand out. So to make the distant elements appear farther away, I used a more muted version of my foreground colors. So grays and a little bit of blue, but even some warm tones back there. Overall though, I kept it less saturated. I added a little bit more water so that they would be diluted and that underlying color of the paper would show through, and overall they just look much less saturated and they draw less attention. And if you're new to gouache, you might find that your colors dry out pretty quickly on the palette, and all you need to do is just get a tiny little spray bottle and spritz it once in a while so that the outer layer doesn't harden. As I approach the mid-ground of the painting, I'm letting my brush kind of dry out so I get some of that dry brush texture. And because the underlying tone is warm, if a little bit shows through, it achieves my goal of having that middle area feel a little bit brighter and a little warmer. But because the light is hitting that middle area of the field, I'm adding a little bit of white so it catches that highlight. And as it progresses down towards the foreground, I'm going to add more and more blue. Depending how much I want that beige color to show through, I will use a little bit more water to dilute it slightly. But in the foreground at the very bottom, I want it to be opaque, so I'll add much more paint there. To create the illusion of distant bushes and trees and stuff, I'm just using very minimal brush strokes. And I find flat brushes are really great for this. Since my fence is going to be front lit, I need to paint the shadows first because, the fence is going to be painted after that in front of the shadows. And so I visualize where my posts are going to be and I sweep some blue shadow color to the right. I also like to create shadows that come from something that's off the side of the page. It just kind of adds more interest and a little more mystery. The viewer can spend some time figuring out what might have caused those shadows. I'm using a warm brown tone for the posts, and I'm making them slightly crooked because I imagine over time the wind and the elements have kind of weathered this fence a lot. To add a bit more interest, some of the posts could be buried in snow or completely fallen over, and I also like to add little grasses and growies near the base of the fence. So if we're adding grasses or anything, we need to create shadows, and they can be coming from off the side of the page, but anything in the painting itself will also need a shadow, of course. Another reason I like to add my shadows first is that it helps me practice my visualization. So before I paint whatever is causing the shadow, if I'm painting the shadow itself, it's forcing my mind to imagine where those objects will be. It's also really great for helping me stay a little bit looser because if I paint the grass first, I find myself getting obsessed with copying or making the shadow perfect. So doing the shadows first and then adding the objects later is a great way to open up your mind a little bit and loosen up, or force yourself to be loose if it's a struggle for you. I'm imagining the fence wire is a little bit old and weathered, and so it's kind of meandering this way and that way, and it's even buried here and there. But after I did that, I realized I never painted the shadows for the fence wire. So it's okay, just went back and added that with a light blue tone and made sure it kind of made sense so it would attach itself to the shadows that were created from the posts, if you know what I mean. I also added a bit of highlight to some of the distant trees and grasses just to kind of indicate that the light was catching their tips or the branches. This painting was kind of nostalgic for me because it reminded me of the fields near where I grew up. And if you watched my recent vlog, I showed lots of snowy scenes here in Scotland, but we don't get nearly as much snow as this. So it just lets me live my fantasy of snowy winter wonderland. If you're enjoying this tutorial, please consider giving the video a thumbs up so YouTube knows that I'm doing a good job. Okay, so after some kitty cuddles, it was time to move on to something a little different, which was going to be a side-lit pine tree covered in snow. This painting was actually a big lesson learned situation, and at first I did not have a strong visual in my mind about what I was trying to do. So this background area, which is in the upper part of the painting, started off as a grassy field, and I was gonna kind of put some touches of snow here and there, but then later it kind of transformed into a forest in the distance. It was a bit of a struggle at first, but once I started to slowly layer things, it kind of came together. So I want to throw that out there to you guys that it really helps to have a strong idea of what you want to paint before you start. And if not, it can work out in the end, but it might be a bit frustrating or a bit of a struggle. My advice in that situation is to just keep going, put marks down, react to your marks in the moment, and you might find that something wonderful happens. In this painting, I did not let a lot of that warm undertone show through. Instead, I used more opaque layers and built up the depth and the warm highlights later. And it was around this time when I started to think that I didn't want it to be a field, and was thinking maybe I could make this distant area a forest. So I started with a few test brush strokes and just kind of seeing if I like the idea of the forest, using a dark color, but I could always come back and lighten them up or even just sweep over with another grassy color if I change my mind again. I just love the fact that gouache is so blendable and you can always fix your mistakes. I started to see the trees and I added little highlights here and there, and it really started to come to life. Ultimately, I didn't pay that much attention to the background, which may have hurt me in the end, but I had a much stronger vision of what I wanted the tree to look like in the foreground. So I just decided to move on to that. Painting trees with gouache is really fun because it's opaque. You can layer it. So you can paint layer by layer or piece by piece. In this case, the trunk, followed by the branches, and then the pine needles, and then the snow. And it's like an easy step-by-step way to approach it. If you're new to painting trees, I have a Skillshare class about this topic, and it walks you through how to draw and paint them, all different types with many different mediums. So if you're interested in that, you can find the link in the description below. I like to start with the trunk and the branches because it gives me a good foundation to move up from. So using a warm brown color, I just lay in a bunch of scraggly little branches, And with the snowy setting, I knew that the snow would be weighing heavily on the boughs, so they would kind of be leaning downwards or dragging on the ground almost, and maybe even partially buried in the snow. So I made sure they kind of all went down towards the ground. To paint pine needles, I usually use a dry brush because it gives me that variety, that visual texture that works really well for something like that versus leaves, which would be a little bit more full. I get a lot of questions about mixing greens, and it always kind of interests me because there's never a situation where you only need to worry about one color. All the colors play together and affect each other. So what I think about instead of color is color temperature. Does something need to be a little bit warmer or a little bit cooler? If it needs to be warmer, add more yellow. If it needs to be cooler, add more blue. And whatever is behind it or next to it makes a difference as well. I have to admit, I love painting snow on top of branches, so I had a lot of fun with this tree. I started off with a slightly diluted white, which became a little bit more blue because I was painting on top of blue. And a lot of times when you paint with white, it immediately starts getting mixed or it'll blend with whatever is next to it or under it. But this worked to my advantage in this situation because it allowed me to get some shadowy snow tones, and then later I could come back with some really bright white highlights and make it pop. So this was just a slow buildup of depth, and I was thinking about how the snow would actually heavily weigh on the branches and where it would be most accumulated or built up. Of course, shadows are important as well, so anytime the branches got closer to the ground, they would cast a shadow, and depending on how high the sun is in the sky, the shadows will either be short or very long across the landscape. After adding all the snow, sometimes I notice my branches have been covered up or completely disappeared, so I can come back with more of my dark shadowy tone and block in some of those branches a little bit stronger. In my next painting, I'm going to demonstrate more of the negative space method for revealing more of that beige undertone in the painting. I don't know if you noticed, but the last couple paintings, I've had my horizon line either off the top of the page or very close to it. This allows me to keep the focus and the majority of my content in the lower 2/3 of the painting and gives me a lot of room to play with my snow features. In this case, I wanted the majority of my painting to be a water reflection or a frozen pond with some snowbanks in the foreground. And to start off, I was just painting what would barely be visible on the distant horizon, which was just at the top of the page. It's an edge of a forest, so I'm using lots of greens. However, they're quite muted, so they're both diluted, and I've added white to kind of dull them down a little bit. Adding white to the colors reduces the saturation, so it's a really easy way to keep these distant elements feeling a little bit further away. In this left area, I wanted the sun to be shining through the trees, so I'm keeping that area a little bit warmer and going to be adding more highlights. But my brushstrokes are still really loose. I just want to kind of hint at the fact that there's sun there. So I'm using chunky brushstrokes and letting things just kind of naturally overlap and blend together. And for the rest of the snowbank, it's going to be more of a cool blue because it's going to be in shadow. Right below this is where the shoreline is going to start. So I'm piling up lots of paint to create my snowbanks, no pun intended. And that negative space where the reflection will be soon will stand out even more. On the underside of that snowbank, I'm adding just a bit of darkness, a dark blue color to be a shadow. And this will help visually separate the snow from what will soon be the water. And now for the fun part. Lots of big dry brush strokes. This dry brush technique is just one of my favorites with gouache, and if your paper is extra textured, so using cold press paper, it'll stand out even more. more of the surface of the paper will show through those dry brush strokes and it'll give you that dappled look. I seriously cannot get enough of dry brush. In terms of placement of these reflections, I'm sort of thinking about where the sun will be, and that's going to have less paint there. Then off to the left and the right, I'll build up that color and the values a little bit more. Now I'm really starting to see where that light is pouring through the trees, so I'm adding a bit more highlight to make it stand out. And I also decided to make the snowbank a little bit higher there, so it feels like the sun is just peeking over the surface of the snow. And then I was starting to think about where my snowbanks were going to be in the foreground. I started sweeping in some very diluted white paint to sort of give the foreground a little bit more snowy, muted, foggy feeling. And then as I was doing that, really strongly visualizing where my actual snowbanks would be. Of course, I could have pre-sketched all of this out, but as I mentioned earlier, I've been practicing my visualization, so by doing it on the fly, it really forces me to think about things in my mind or see them in my mind before I put it down on paper. And honestly, the mystery of that process to me is really fun and also a little bit addictive. It's almost like I'm putting puzzle pieces together as I paint. Anyways, in order to capture these snowbanks, I started off with a moderate amount of white, but the second I start painting it with white, it blends with what's already on the paper, so it becomes a little bit more colorful. And that's good because in the end, we want to carefully place our brightest brights. Anywhere that we want the sun to be glimmering off the snow is going to be bright white, and the rest of it should be slightly more muted by some other color. I like to use blue and purples in my snow because oftentimes that is what is reflecting off the surface. But it does depend on the other colors in your painting and the overall feeling or atmosphere you have. I just really loved how the cool blue snow stood out against that warm reflection on the water. Once again, the underside of the snowbanks received a bit of shadow, and on top of the snowbanks, I needed to create some kind of interest because I didn't want to just have some boring snowbanks there. So I decided to have the foreground be covered in lots of long, meandering shadows, which were going to be coming from some tall grasses that were leaning over the water and kind of dotted in the snow. Believe it or not, these grasses and the shadows were totally improvised in the moment. I didn't really think about that ahead of time, but in the end, to me, it's the best part of the painting. It just adds so much more interest. It makes it more dynamic. And man, I just love long shadows. I find it interesting how in a painting like this, where the background is so stylized and pretty much almost abstract, if you add details or something more detailed and recognizable in the foreground, the background just becomes this supporting character. It gives it so much more interest and so much more life. You know what's going on because the foreground is telling that story, and it gives the background context. So it's just something to think about. If you love that loose, stylized feeling, maybe consider having most of the painting be kind of abstract and loose, and then one little area will be detailed and a very recognizable object. Give it a try and see how you like it. Okay, so that wraps up the tutorial, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments, and I would super appreciate it if you give the video a thumbs up, and if you want to see more videos from me, make sure you subscribe. And don't forget, I have a ton of tutorials over on Skillshare as well as my Patreon, so thank you guys for joining me, and I'll see you again soon.